Hello and welcome to another new episode of Leading with Women by Egomon. Joining us today is Tayo Akinyemi. She has been working at the intersection of African outliers, entrepreneurship, research, and innovation. Currently with the RSA in the United States, she has been a part of multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the United Nations. As the first executive director of AfriLabs, she is passionate about capacity building in technology hubs and incubators. Hello, Tayo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rahi. I'm really excited to be here. It's really a privilege.
No, it's our pleasure. So, Tayo, you have devoted most of your life towards African tech, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So, this question easily flows out. What makes Africa's market realities unique?
It's a really good question. And so, arguably, when you think about what differentiates markets, there are certain characteristics that are common to look at. So, whether it's consumer markets, the characteristics of the markets themselves when it comes to supply chains or infrastructure, legal and governance structures, the quality of the quote unquote doing in business environment. But I actually co-published a report earlier this year called Chasing Outliers, Why Context Matters for Early Stage Investing in Africa. And in that work, we actually focused on the characteristics of consumer markets. And so in African markets, although it can be really problematic to generalize in this way because Africa is a massive continent with 54 different countries, there's a way in which we learned that there are certain things that seem common. So, firstly, African consumers tend to have, let's say, lower amounts of purchasing power, less disposable income. They are less likely to want to consume fully digital solutions. There is a preference for tech touch, meaning that there is a human at some point in the interaction or the transaction. They tend to be both difficult and expensive to acquire due to factors around things like access to internet, the cost of data, whether people are living in rural or urban settings. They also tend to be quite utility sensitive, which means that you really have to be delivering a product or service that fulfills some sort of need, a critical need in their lives. And they also tend to be, for that reason, quite discerning. So these are some of the characteristics that we encountered when looking at African consumer markets.
So, you've clearly laid out points where you tell us why African realities are so different. In this, it's clear that the Silicon Valley venture capital model cannot actually be copy pasted like it is probably attempted in a lot of places. So, why can't the African ecosystem exist or thrive as a clone of the Silicon Valley VC model?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, and it's as amusing as it is problematic. So you'll start to see clone names even. So Silicon Savannah, Silicon Alley, Silicon Mountain, fill in the blank. And what that presupposes, although to be fair, part of the reason this happens is because Silicon Valley style investing is arguably the global standard or one of the global standards for investing, given that venture capital technically was born in this part of the US. But that said, if you are taking these models and applying them elsewhere, you're also going to assume that some of the enabling conditions or assumptions driving that application will apply in these markets, and there are ways in which they don't. So, for example, if you think about this idea of exponential returns, right? The idea is that you are investing a small amount of resources, whether it's capital or mentorship, strategic advisory, etc., and you're getting exponential returns. That's partly predicated on the idea that the marginal cost to grow, so the additional amount of money you have to spend to acquire new customers, continue to build your product, etc., is zero or close to zero. And the reason it would be so low is because you have, well-developed infrastructure, for example, to enable that. So if you think about Amazon, which has taken, more than 2 decades to become profitable, you can imagine how much more difficult that would have been if they didn't have, or if it didn't have access to infrastructure like the United States Postal Service and private delivery services such as FedEx. So this idea of a minimal cost to growth doesn't necessarily hold in African markets. Another aspect that I think is a little bit challenging, which we've already talked about, is the characteristics of consumer markets. So the assumption when you're talking about Silicon Valley type of investing is that you have large amounts of consumers who have high degrees of purchasing power who are going to consume fully digital solutions. And you're going to use tech basically to reach those customers in a fully scaled, affordable way. Whereas, as we've described in many African consumer markets, you don't have a lot of purchasing power. You're not deploying fully digital models, and so that becomes difficult. I would say another aspect of that has to do with, again, the size of the returns. So Silicon Valley
Okay.
style investment is predicated on something called the power law. So in a portfolio of, let's say, 10 companies, you're expecting one company to quote unquote return the fund, which basically means that this one success is so large that it will absorb all of the losses or any
Mm.
just kind of flat return of capital and other investments. And so when you have some of the characteristics that I described before of markets, it makes reaching quote unquote the $1 billion exit a little bit harder.
So if so what you're saying is that there are expectations and the expectations are unrealistic because you cannot expect the way a company shot up maybe in the US will not probably do the same in Africa. So in that, what are some venture capital funding models that you believe could be a better fit?
Great question. And actually, it's a question I'm actively trying to answer. I don't have the answer yet, but I think there are signs in the market of decisions being made to better accommodate African market realities. So one of the aspects that typically causes a good amount of friction is the time frame or the time horizon. So the proposition is that there are still really amazing opportunities on the continent. So despite the litany of challenges I just described, that doesn't negate the fact that these challenges actually kind of create a framework or a platform for really robust opportunities. But the idea is that it might take longer for some of these opportunities to be realized, and so some level of flexibility within how long you're expected to take to deliver exits might be useful. And so the way this is showing up in some investing structures is by launching permanent capital vehicles or evergreen structures, which basically don't have a prescribed, let's say, deadline for rolling up the fund and delivering exits. So in a typical fund structure, you're expected to, from, let's say, the point at which you invest to exit, that's meant to be about 10 years, plus or minus 2 years. In a permanent capital vehicle or an evergreen structure, that bid is open-ended, so you can exit when it makes sense.
So it's going to be need basis.
Exactly. And there are a couple of other models that are, let's say, less focused on the time horizon piece, but more focused on the challenges that maybe people who are raising funds have to convince people to give them money to deploy in a traditional fund, and then also democratizing access to these investment opportunities. So that's when you see models like rolling funds and syndicates, which I suppose is more like a peer-based or community model. So the rolling fund or syndicate will source the deals, charge a membership fee for fellow investors to participate, and then these investors will kind of opt in on a deal by deal basis, or even on a, let's say, a time basis, so like a quarterly basis.
And can they also exit whenever they want to?
That's the part that is tricky. So from what I understand, typically no. The rolling fund or the
Okay.
syndicate will manage the investment and determine when it's appropriate to exit. And so the advice they give is you should still have the same expectations that it's going to take 5, 10,
Okay.
15 years for the exit to be realized. But the fund will let investors know when an exit is about to be brokered and kind of communicate to them how much they'll profit and such.
So what is the kind of traction that these alternative funding models have had? Like, is it still in this its research phase? Has it successfully been rolled out and has positive results? Where is it at right now?
Yeah, I think it's still quite early days. I mean, arguably, you can say that about the entire ecosystem. So we're just starting to see really credible exits in the general ecosystem. So these are models that are just starting to appear on the horizon. So I think I've encountered maybe three that are currently investing, and obviously the results in terms of returns are yet to be seen. But there's one called Future Africa that was launched by a co-founder of Vandela, which is basically a global marketplace for tech talent, which has had a focus on Africa. He's also built a payments company called Flutterwave. So I guess his nickname is has also co-founded Future Africa to enable other folks, other investors to benefit from the deals that Future Africa puts together.
And let's hope it sees a positive future and that it becomes mainstream.
Exactly.
So, in all of this, what role do you think that the African diaspora plays? Does that, like, how much of an influence do they have in the African startup ecosystem?
Really interesting question. And so you'll find members of the diaspora everywhere. I mean, there are some who are quote unquote in the arena, launching businesses on the ground. So a good example of that, that I can recall is Vivian Nwaka. She actually had never lived in on the continent before she launched MedSafe, which is essentially a business. It's basically a tech-driven marketplace for medication, so that health stakeholders can source them more cheaply and efficiently. Or Sarah Menker, who is of Ethiopian heritage, who I think has raised the largest Series B of an African woman ever. And her business is AI driven, kind of, let's say, market intelligence for food markets. So there's a whole really impressive group of members of the diaspora who are basically building businesses, and there are others who are, helping to build the infrastructure by starting funds. So there's a fund called, what's it called now? First Check, I believe, Africa, and they are focused basically on providing the first, I think it's 25 to 50K, 15 to 15 to 25K, somewhere in there, for women founders at the ideation stage, because unfortunately there aren't very many women founders who are getting capital. So they've launched First Check. I think it was toward the end of last year, to address this problem. And there are other funds that are dedicated exclusively to women who are arguably building ecosystems as well.
But what about you? You are part of the African diaspora. So, how do you uniquely position yourself in Africa's startup funding narrative?
Great question. So historically, I've really been focused, again, on, let's call it, enabling infrastructure. To give a more concrete example,
Okay.
I was the first executive director of AfriLabs, which is a Pan-African network of tech hubs. And the key premise behind tech hubs in the network, because it was launched, wow, I think more than a decade ago, about a decade ago, was essentially to say that innovators and entrepreneurs need community, but they also need access to infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I mean power, internet, and things of this nature. So these tech hubs and then the network as a whole basically provided spaces to enable serendipity, the type of serendipity that innovation thrives on, where people who are like-minded can come together build. And then I spent a little bit of time with the World Bank on a Pan-African digital accelerator called Excel Africa. And the premise there was essentially that there was a gap between pre-seed and Series A funding. You kind of like the growth chasm, essentially. And so this was a pilot to sort of see if there was a way to bridge that gap with an accelerator. But I would say more recently, I've been more focused on insights from the perspective of understanding how these systems work. So to your point, if we're not going to have Silicon Valley clones, either from the perspective of startups or from the perspective of funds, I mean, what are we going to have? So in the menagerie of like of mythical animals, if we're not having unicorns, then are they going to be gazelles or gorillas or gazelle-corns or what have you? So I'm trying to sort out what the optimal funding models are and what the key characteristics of high growth outliers on the continent are.
Because everything can't be measured by just a billion mark or just some monetary mark there. There has to be other units of measurement.
Exactly right. I would like to believe so. I mean, the $1 billion is really a valuation. The idea is that how you define success on the continent arguably can and should be defined by things that are just not focused on valuation. So things beyond valuation.
All right. So Tayo, we talked about your interests, we talked about your past life where you were the first executive director of AfriLabs, you've worked with international organizations. But what's next? What do you see as the next phase for yourself?
Really interesting question. So it's going to be, or what it actually is now, is a combination of content creation and let's call it insight excavation. So I've launched a podcast called The Trajectory Africa, basically trying to articulate where African tech and VC is going. So are we in fact looking for unicorns or something else? And if it's something else, what does it mean? And if it's something else, what are the enabling conditions? What are we looking at? Businesses that serve businesses that serve consumers? How do you best support and invest in them? And then on the fund structure side, again, how do you manage some of the challenges that come with these investments in terms of time horizon, in terms of quote unquote selling the Africa case to investors who will enable funds to invest on the continent and such. So it's a combination of looking for insight and creating content.
So it's like, since you don't have an existing blueprint to work on, you have to actually create the blueprint for future, so that it gets better in the future, it gets easier to navigate in the future.
That's exactly right. In fact, one of my co-authors for Chasing Outliers kind of describes ecosystem development in this way. So in the beginning, you find in nascent ecosystems, you find a lot of copy and paste based on other models in phase one. And then in phase two, you start to see local adaptation, if you like, tweaking. And then in phase three, where things really start to take off, that's when you start to see completely localized and context-specific models. So trying to understand where all of this is going and retroactively, I guess, drawing out the blueprint is exactly what I hope to contribute to.
And I wish you all the best in that endeavor, Tayo. Thank you again for coming here and speaking to us.
Thank you so much, Rahi. This was fun and again, a pleasure.